Thank you, appreciate it. Morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Africa, Rashid, and everyone for the invitation, for the very kind and generous introduction. So yes, I'm mostly an educator. I'm an architect, and most of my career I have been teaching. And I thought today, inspired by the Netherlands connection, to tell a little bit of a story leading up to how my thinking has been formulated and how that influences my teaching. So I originate from the Sudan. I graduated from architecture in 1988 from the Khartoum University many years ago, where I did my basic degree, and I taught at the University of Khartoum, and I worked in my father's practice, who's also an architect. And I spent some time in the Netherlands at the very young age of 24, where I was studying at the Institute for Housing in Rotterdam. And it had a huge influence on my career and on my teaching and on my understanding of the built environment. I went back to the Sudan and continued to teach at the University of Khartoum and various other institutes in Khartoum, and continued to work in my father's practice. And then just by coincidence, I ended up in Southern Africa. And I started off in Maseru as a United Nations volunteer. And then I, again, completely by coincidence, found myself at the University of Pretoria. Completely by coincidence, I ended up being there for 11 years and did my PhD there. So nothing was really planned. But that connection with the Netherlands continues, and you'll see that in what I present. But before I go there, what I did in Khartoum was I worked in my dad's practice, and we produced, his office produced prolifically in a lot of small and large-scale projects, but mostly residential projects in Khartoum. So this is the kind of work I did. A lot of it was also multifamily housing. So I did that for many years. And then, as I said, I ended up in the Netherlands, and there's at least one person who studied at the IHS here, and maybe there are more, under the instruction of a Raoul de Lulu in 1992. And as I was going through my old documents to prepare for this talk, because I was just inspired, Netherlands connection and my the influence that the Netherlands had on my career, I dug out some of my old documents, and when I went to the Netherlands, I had never used a computer, and I didn't know how to type. So I ended up producing a 128-page document, completely handwritten. And that's, I'm fascinated at how I was able to do that. So this is just an image towards the end of the document. I produce what I refer to as a generative graph, very much influenced by my instructor at the time, Raoul de Lulu. So the whole idea of the generative graph is that instead of designing one house type, or several types for that matter, we design 128 ways that a core unit, a seed, a wet core can evolve into a house. So there are 128 routes to get there. So that is, sorry. So that is what the final house unit would look like, but there are 128 ways to get there. And my final paragraph, as I said, everything was handwritten, was to explain that this generative graph is a process-oriented design approach and not a product-oriented approach. It avoids providing a single line of development. An architect provides multiple ways for which a residential unit could grow, and it is referred to as positive control. And one of the things that I focused on was that the houses at every stage of development needed to be functional and needed to work. So as we go further, you'll see how much this thinking, this focus on process rather than product, has influenced my practice and my teaching over many years. So I then, because of what I had been taught in the Netherlands, became very influenced by John Houbraken. His seminal work was published first in 1961, supports an alternative to mass housing. And this very iconic image on the left is of the collective on the one side and the individual on the other side, and the aspirations of the collective and the individual being mediated by the built environment. And I then went on to be hugely influenced by books such as The Structure of the Ordinary, where he argues that this is how the built environment has always been conceived and developed, and there was a disruption because of modernist thinking. Okay, so because of these connections, I then got to know architects like Frans van der Werf, got to really understand thinking about the built environment in terms of levels. Stephen Kendall in the USA represents it a little bit differently, but basically the long-term elements in the built environment, who controls that, the collective, moving down to the shorter-term elements, and who controls that. So this way of thinking really influenced the way I think about cities and space and neighborhoods. And so what do I teach based on that? So these are the principles that I focus on teaching: developing a system where the government is a facilitator, distributing decision-making in the built environment, separating the levels of the built environment so that different people make decisions at different levels without disrupting the overall functioning and coherence of a neighborhood or a city. How do we design and plan for an unknown future? Distribute control, who makes which decisions when, understanding cities' infrastructure and the built environment in terms of levels, systems, and connections. The idea of disentanglement, very much an open building principle, making changes to one system without disrupting others. And then, of course, what I mentioned earlier, mediating between individuals and the collective in the built environment. So this has influenced everything that I've done, this way of thinking that I learned at that very young age. So it's influenced my practice. This is a hostel upgrade in Gauteng. It was never built. These are residential units that were built in central Pretoria, working on top of existing church halls, finding gaps in the city where one can intervene with housing. And this is a woman's residence in Pretoria, which was also built, but also everything throughout the whole design process, very deliberately showing process drawings here. It was influenced by this idea of users participating, making decisions, not just initially, but throughout the lifetime of the project. So throughout my career, I focused on open building and its applications in South Africa, and looking at alternative housing strategies and teaching design by looking at local knowledge informing the processes, but also looking at the city as a laboratory. So this is the kind of work that I did over the years, building up partnerships with proximate communities. And they would usually be multi-year partnerships because I really believed in that. So I didn't really believe in just going in, doing something and leaving, but building up a longer-term relationship, taking the students outside of the campus and outside of the traditional studio, working with local artists and artisans, and a lot of times identifying skills and materials that were proximate to the site, not going too far away from the site. And I carried that through in my work at the University of Johannesburg in 2015, working in inner city Johannesburg. And throughout this process, what we tried to do is find ways or encourage or motivate for innovation and experimentation. And I think there's very little innovation and experimentation happening in South Africa, and I'm happy to be challenged. And I would actually be very happy if throughout this day, people say to me, no, you're missing this or that or that. But I really believe there's very little. And I spent a bit of time with Platform 31 in the Netherlands. I hope the Dutch people here know Platform 31, but just looking at ideas around defining innovation, supporting innovation, investing in innovation, and then encouraging open and transparent knowledge sharing. So based on those principles, I kind of developed a set of principles myself in terms of devising systems that self-regulate, because I don't think we have the capacity to regulate, devising systems that increase resilience, and devising systems that reduce control at some levels, allowing for emergence and informality to coexist with other systems. Now, we live in a highly unequal society, and it's been questioned whether we can achieve resilience and whether we can have successful environments if the environments don't work both for the rich and the poor. And despite some of the controversies around the spirit level, there's some things that emerge from that study that really resonate with me. Greater economic equality, not greater wealth, is the mark of the most successful societies. The life-diminishing results of valuing growth over equality. It is not just the poor, but whole societies from top to bottom that are adversely affected by inequality. I'm showing two images here. On the left-hand side is a tea lady who works along the Nile rivers in Khartoum. There are literally hundreds of them, and the constant threat of being removed by the authorities. And on the right, there's an image of the very local and very visible transport system in Kigali, in Rwanda. And you can see an image of the city in the background, the modern city of Kigali. And that modern image of the city is something that kind of dominates our thinking about future African cities. This is an image from inside a building in Khartoum, my hometown. And I say here that a lot of times when we think about future African cities, we're thinking of visions of Wakanda. We're thinking of markets interspersed with African-inspired high-rise glass and steel structures and materials. Wakanda, partially realized or mere plans, really dominates our thinking about the future African cities. Khartoum, my hometown, the Sunut development, has been referred to, it's partially realized, and it's been referred to as Dubai on the Nile or Sudan's Manhattan. And an urban forest of Sunut trees was destroyed in its development. My mother says they have removed all the trees, built the neighborhoods, and called them after the trees. And I wrote about this, and then my friend Geshe Sabina responded to me on LinkedIn. And she said she was reminded of that song. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot and took all the trees and put them in a museum. And Geshe says, let's keep up the engagement and activism and reflection and imagining and experimenting. We might yet evolve an African aesthetic that is astonishing and fulfilling and ours. Now, the problem with that imagery for me is that it really reduces people's access to opportunities. It's not just an image. It implies a skill and an interface with the public realm that is exclusive and exclusionary. It doesn't relate to a finer grain of existing urban fabric. It doesn't imply a relationship with the streets that encourages different levels of commercial activity. And the imagery is highly problematic in that it lacks sensitivity to climate and context, and I think it demonstrates a lack of creativity and imagination. The smaller and more subtle interventions and successes aren't as visible or compelling, and yet they probably have immense catalytic and transformational potential. And they are vital for the survival of the smaller players in cities. And I want to present here a provocation, which I've made a habit of presenting this at every forum, that nothing presented today in the last 24 years in South Africa, in terms of visions, images, spatial design, technology, policy, and economic models, has been as powerful as what the apartheid planners presented. And I think if we are able to present something that is more powerful, we would find ways to implement it. And again, if I'm wrong, I hope the rest of this day will prove me wrong. I just cannot find it. And the reality is space has power, it is political, it's never neutral, it has meaning. And every day space tells us, are we valued, are we important, and do we count? Space can exclude, it can humiliate, intimidate, or anger. And one of my favorite quotes, unfortunately I don't know the author, is create inhumane environments and people will respond likewise. And we see that in places like Cape Town. We saw it erupt, immense anger in 2017. I wrote about that at the time, if you're interested in looking at some of my thinking around that, where I said South Africa urgently needs to rethink its approach to housing. I wrote about similar issues in 2015 with the student protests and linked them very strongly to the spatial realities of South Africa. Problems erupted again last year in Westbury, and the anger just goes on. And it's actually beyond South Africa. It's a global issue, this battle for space in cities. And in 2016, I wrote on Sudan student protests and how much city planning and design matter. You're welcome to please check these articles. So we need to facilitate inclusive transformation through the promotion of policy, legal, finance, and design models that achieve quality and participative form-giving and space-making. Viable and affordable development strategies to allow for access to opportunity, equity, and diversity. And we need to do that through systems that are inherently participative, through new professional guidelines, through new systems, methods, and technologies, new forms of engagement, but most importantly, replicating that at a scale that really has impact, and we're failing to do that. And I get very frustrated, and maybe those models and that approach I presented that I learned in the Netherlands, one of the most important things about a process-oriented versus product-oriented approach to design is this issue of participation. So participation needs to be thought of as a distribution of decision-making. It is not as simple as some people make it out to be, but then there are very real tools to be able to achieve it. So we can rethink, as an example, subsidy allocations and what subsidies subsidize if we're thinking about participation, or how space is designed to encourage ongoing participation over time as opposed to one-off participation. And one of the quotes that really influences me is by Dewar, where he says that participation is not about asking people what they want as people's expectations are experientially determined. And as designers, we need to be showing what other alternatives there are out there. We adopt a religious fervor when speaking about participation. I have a problem with that. And the last 2 points there is, if we fail to fully understand participation, we disadvantage our professions by not equipping future designers properly for practice, and we disadvantage communities by not providing good professional service. So we need to see how we can operate at project level, perhaps to influence policy, to influence at a larger level, and we need to manage project funds differently to be able to distribute decision-making among different stakeholders. So in 2010, we developed a 10-point vision for sustainable, humane settlements. I'm giving you 2 examples of the 10-point vision. Point number 3 is just add housing. Thought about a salt shaker. The image shows housing descending on places like the Menlyn Shopping Centre in Pretoria, and we could think of many more examples. But housing added to existing city fabric and not outside of it. And point number 6 is street edge activation. Having a wall tax. If you have a blank wall, you pay a tax for the length of wall. And using those edges to be activated to put social housing and not giving development approvals unless those edges are activated in some way. So the African city is a city that has developed tools to manage stability and change, to accommodate for the formal and the informal. It's inclusive, it allows for complexity, the unexpected and the unknown. We need to reimagine the African city as a livable city, equitable, beautiful, functional. It has diverse opportunities. It offers people a chance at improving their lives and their livelihoods. And here, very much using an open building term, it's a lovable city. It resonates with many people over many years. It accommodates and embraces diversity, choice, and change. And it's embedded in its context and climate. So I'll conclude here. And my mum took that photo because I was asked to be fun. So, and I wanted to respond to Rashik that I consider myself more of a boring academic rather than fun. But I hope people haven't been too bored. But I'll conclude with 3 things. One of them is this idea of participation, how our design methods and the way that we operate and the way that we manage the built, that's participation. I get incredibly tired of people sitting around a table and talking, because probably by the time they leave that table, their needs have changed. So if I'm really designing to accommodate people's needs, the built environment needs to be designed in such a way that over its lifetime, it allows for those changes. So the other thing is, oh yes, so please do get involved with regards to open building thinking. I manage or jointly coordinate an international network of open building thinkers and practitioners. Do get involved with that, and let us have more conversations around that. And then just because this photo was taken in Khartoum, and I'm using every platform to remind people not to forget the young professionals in Khartoum who are risking their lives for regime change now. And the more attention we bring to them, the less the killing. So that's incredibly important for me, and thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Amira, if you can stay on the stage just to take 1 or 2 questions. I don't know about you, but I was certainly not bored by that. In fact, I was inspired. And one of the, I suppose, thoughts I want us to talk about at some point is sometimes government is seen to be responding to an emergency. So there's a fire right now, we need to build housing. There's a protest on the N2, so we need to build housing. And can we still afford the opportunity to really engage in the way that you've suggested, where there is quite inclusive participation in creating those lovable and livable cities when there's somebody who's homeless today because of a fire this morning? But let's take a question from Julian.
Thank you. That was brilliant. This is really just an admin question, really, and asking about the nature and character of this event. Can you share your presentation with everybody? Will the presentations be shared for transparency and sharing purposes?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry? No fees. I'm an academic. I don't get paid much, and I share everything openly. So definitely, if they will put it on a website or something.
Hi, that's a brilliant presentation. I really appreciate it. One thing that comes across strongly in the work that's done in cities is a lack of appreciation for the green environment, other than in its coal-based incarnation. But have you got thoughts on how the value of greening, which is so difficult to allocate, such as in Cape Town, where water has been cut off from greening because of its usage in an exotic way?
I think it just needs to be like some of the principles I'm speaking about now. That, buildings that have capacity for change and for being reused in the future and so on. The same thing around green. I don't like the idea of things being compartmentalized, like this is a green architect or this is a green building. Every building should be green. It just, and in our teaching, we do try and emphasize that it just needs to be a part of your design process and design thinking for every single project. Part of the visions that we've developed, we also say that there needs to be food production in every single urban project. So ultimately, we might get there, but I hope I'm answering you.
She's going to be here the whole day. You can find it. We're going to take one final question before we go to the next speaker.
Thank you. My name is Di. A lot of where we're finding challenges talking about green is that there doesn't seem to be any consistent or retrospective thinking once a green environment has been greened or created. Hypothetical, a building is built in Cape Town, it passes green building standards, but it doesn't allow for any development after the building is constructed that might consider, excuse me, how would we benefit the city and the building and the people who are going to live or work in the building if we were to green the rooftops of the building? How could we network into the wastewater systems in our building to add greenness to the roof, which then gives us not only a carbon exchange environment, but gives us a recreational environment for people who live and work in the building? I think the point I'm trying to make is most architects and landscapers close their eyes and their ears once a building is up, and they exclude its future potential. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think what my talk was trying to emphasize is that you build in the capacity for change in every intervention that you make, and that would include the ability to retrofit and include new ways of either food growing or rainwater collections, or So, I mean, the buildings just need to be able to do that. And they need to be able to adapt over time. But also one thing that you've reminded me of now is that we need to integrate our environments and not have this way of doing that is there, or that particular type of housing is there, and very distinct. And if we can think in terms of the levels thinking that I introduced here, we would be able to create much more integrated environments that accommodate everyone and where the collective space accommodates everyone. And that, in a way, it relates to what you're saying about people designing and going and never going back to assess. It's because there's an inherent built-in capacity for places and buildings to take those changes over time. So anyway, I hope that at least adds to that conversation.
Amira, thank you very much for that. I know I did say that was the last one, and Leander said he has a comment to make about education. As indicated, Amira is going to be here for the whole day, and I'm going to ask you please to just approach her perhaps during tea break and lunchtime. Otherwise, I'm going to be really, really running late with my program. Leander, you've got the final word for the moment.
Thank you so much, and much appreciated. I'd like you to make a statement, because I agree with you. There's been very little innovation coming out, especially on the spatial side. But my concern is I don't think we should expect that from the government. The production of knowledge happens somewhere else, and it happens at university, in my view. So can you maybe give a comment in terms of, is not your university, but are our universities actually playing the role they should be playing in the production of knowledge for us to think differently?
Well, Luyanda, thank you so much for that. And Luyanda is president of the South African Institute of Architects, and we are governed by other organizations like SACAP, South African South African Council for the Architectural Profession, and they kind of oversee what universities do. So I think it's a collective thing, Luyanda. I think we need to work very strongly together. So you, in your roles currently, can very much guide academia in the right direction. And academia would then have to respond to that if it becomes a part of our professional practice guidelines or requested by our professional organizations, then academia will start responding to it. I think there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of transformation within academia, so I'm not negative about that at all, but I also think our institutions need to transform. And there's a lot, and probably Andy will know that you know, the architects that work in informal settlements, that isn't really acknowledged by our architectural professional councils. So we need to, the conversation to allow for those experimental projects and to allow for innovation, to allow for young architects to enter those spaces. Our academia definitely needs to sort itself out, but our professional institutes need to collaborate with us on that. And I'm looking forward to you. I'm looking forward to you leading that process, and I'm very optimistic.
Thank you very much. A round of applause, please, for Professor Amira Osman.